Welcome back, my dear literature enthusiasts. Those of you who know that cinema, at its best, is not just about explosions or chases, but about the intricate tapestry of meaning woven beneath the surface. Today, we're turning our gaze to the Bourne Legacy, a 2012 entry in the canon of modern spy thrillers. Before we go any further, let me just pause to say this. If you find joy in thoughtful explorations of film, if you love diving past the surface into the themes, symbols, and layered storytelling choices that filmmakers often tuck away for curious eyes, then you've found your corner of the internet. Please take a moment to like this video, and if you haven't already, subscribe. It means more than just numbers. It's a way of keeping this little community alive, a circle of minds that value film not only as entertainment, but as literature. And just so we're absolutely clear, this isn't a traditional review. What I'm offering here isn't a breakdown of whether the movie is good or bad in any shallow sense. This is an intellectual analysis, a critical engagement with film as text, meant for those of us who approach movies the way we'd approach a novel or a poem. Carefully, curiously, lovingly. I'll be honest, this particular story struck me in ways I didn't expect. Maybe it's because I've always been fascinated by narratives where characters grapple with the aftermath of someone else's myth. Growing up, I often felt like I was living in the shadow of stories that weren't mine, family legacies, cultural expectations, even the silent weight of history. Watching a character navigate a world shaped by the choices of another resonated deeply with me. I found myself reflecting on those moments in life where you realize you're carrying burdens that were never yours to begin with, yet you must shoulder them anyway. That's where this film found me, not just as a story of espionage, but as a mirror of my own struggle to reconcile individuality with inherited weight. The film situates itself in the wake of chaos left by another man's journey. A program of control and surveillance begins to crack, and those caught in its web scramble to maintain order, to cover tracks, to protect secrets too volatile to expose. Into this fractured world steps a new operative, one who has been forged by the same system, yet is forced to carve out his own survival. He's not driven by ideology or grand notions of rebellion. His fight is far simpler, far more human. Survival, connection, the primal need to endure when the system designed you as expendable. What fascinated me wasn't just the high-stakes tension, but the subtle question that runs beneath. How much of our identity belongs to us, and how much is written by forces beyond our control? On a surface level, the film offers all the hallmarks of the genre. Shadowy agencies, covert missions, breathtaking escapes. The pacing is relentless, scenes unfolding with a taut energy that seems to mimic the pounding of the protagonist's pulse as he runs, climbs, and fights to stay ahead of the machinery designed to erase him. Yet beneath the adrenaline lies a quieter story. I couldn't help but notice how the narrative lingers on moments of exhaustion, of quiet desperation. There's something profoundly literary in those pauses, something that reminded me of reading novels where silence says more than action ever could. The plot itself unfolds like a spiral. At first, the operative seems to be just another cog in the wheel, someone following orders, honing his body and mind into a weapon sharpened by others. But when the machinery begins to collapse, when threads unravel and programs turn on their own, he realizes that the very system that made him now seeks to erase him. It's a familiar motif, the creator turning on the creation, the parent abandoning the child, but reimagined here in the sterile language of modern geopolitics and science. Watching it unfold, I couldn't help but think about how institutions, be they governments, corporations, or even families, so often do the same. They shape us, mold us, demand our loyalty, and when it no longer serves them, they discard us. The most exciting part, though, lies in the chase. There's a momentum that builds, a sense that every decision tightens the noose, that every narrow escape only leads into deeper peril. One scene in particular, an escape across rooftops pursued with merciless precision, stayed with me long after I finished the film. It wasn't just the spectacle of it, though that was thrilling. It was the symbolism, the operative running not only from pursuers but from the very identity, he was given. Each leap felt like an act of defiance, each landing a declaration that he refused to be erased. I've had moments in my own life where I felt like I was sprinting from definitions imposed on me, from roles that were never mine to claim. That's why it resonated, not as fantasy, but as allegory. The narrative teases out key elements with precision. The science behind the program isn't just window dressing. It's a metaphor for control, for how far institutions will go to shape bodies and minds to their will. The pills, the enhancements, the rigid schedules of training, these become symbols of how deeply the system infiltrates identity. When those controls are stripped away, the protagonist doesn't just fight for survival. He fights for the chance to be human on his own terms. It reminded me of how, in our own lives, we sometimes need to let go of the scripts handed to us by society, to risk instability in order to find authenticity. And then, of course, there are the twists, the revelations that the system is even darker, even more far-reaching than we imagined. I won't spoil the specifics, but I will say this. The narrative refuses to give us comfort. It doesn't resolve neatly, doesn't tie every thread. Instead, it leaves us in a state of uncertainty, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable truth that systems of power rarely collapse just because one person resists them. Yet within that uncertainty lies hope. The hope that even small acts of defiance, even one life reclaimed from control, can matter. By the end, what lingered with me wasn't the spectacle, though that was impressive. It was the intimacy of survival, the fragility of identity, the raw humanity of someone refusing to be reduced to a disposable asset. That's what makes this film, for me, less a spy thriller and more a work of literature. It uses genre as a vehicle, but carries within it questions that echo in philosophy, psychology, and personal memory. It's why I wanted to bring it to you today, not as a review, but as an invitation to think, to connect, to recognize our own struggles in the chase of a man who refuses to disappear. So as we step further into this exploration, I invite you to sit with the questions it raises. What defines us? How much of who we are is written by us? And how much by systems we can't control? And perhaps most importantly, what happens when we decide to run, not just from danger, but from the identities we never chose? These are the questions I carry with me after watching, and I hope you carry them too. Because in the end, that's what makes cinema worth exploring. Not the answers, but the conversations it sparks, the memories it stirs, the reflections it invites us to share. The first half of the story begins not with the frantic chaos we usually expect from a spy thriller, but with something quieter, almost meditative. We meet a man who exists in silence and discipline, a figure bound by the routines of a program designed to refine him into something more than human and, paradoxically, something less. His introduction is a study in physicality, alone in vast landscapes, testing his limits, training not just body but instinct. There's something haunting about those early moments. The mountains rising in stark beauty, the cold biting at his skin, his every action reminding us that survival is not a gift, but a skill carved from repetition. What struck me watching this part wasn't just the spectacle of it. It was the solitude. There's a particular loneliness in characters who are sharpened into weapons. I've felt echoes of it myself. In times when I was trying to live up to roles others assigned to me, when discipline felt more like confinement than growth. That's what drew me in. He isn't introduced as a glamorous figure. He's a man stripped to function, living in isolation, yet yearning, quietly, for something beyond orders and pills. Very quickly, the film begins to pull the ground out from under him. We discover that while he is enduring these grueling exercises, forces far above his reach are already moving to erase him. The very program that created him is collapsing in on itself, consumed by paranoia after previous operations unravel. The bureaucratic voices at the top speak in cold tones about liabilities and clean slates, reducing lives to numbers, reducing extraordinary men to mere mistakes that must be scrubbed out. This is where the tension first claws at the heart, because we know he's not just a number, not just another expendable asset. Yet the system insists otherwise. The way this plays out is brutal. Operatives across the globe, men and women shaped by the same system, begin to vanish one by one. The machinery of erasure is merciless. For our protagonist, the realization comes slowly at first, then with violent clarity. The training that once made him feel powerful now becomes the chain that marks him for death. Every injection, every pill, every enhancement he has relied on turns into a tether. Proof that his body isn't entirely his own, that his survival is linked to forces he cannot control. I found this aspect deeply unsettling. It reminded me of how often we depend on systems, institutions, even routines, only to realize how fragile that dependence makes us when those systems decide we no longer matter. The plot tightens as he begins to sense that his isolation is no accident. The people meant to monitor and guide him fall silent. Supplies dry up. An attack disguised as routine oversight reveals the truth. They want him gone. The first major chase sequence unspools with breathtaking urgency. He moves through the wilderness with the instincts of prey and predator combined, hunted by drones that embody the faceless cruelty of bureaucracy. The drone sequence stayed with me, not just because it was thrilling, but because of what it symbolized. The system doesn't send people to erase him. It sends machines. It sends cold, unfeeling weapons that mirror the very thing it tried to make of him. Watching him turn that hunt into a fight for his own survival was exhilarating in the moment and sobering in reflection. But what truly defines the first half isn't only the action. It's the way the narrative begins to entwine him with others. Enter the figure of a scientist, a woman whose expertise in the program's chemical engineering makes her both essential and expendable. Her world collapses as swiftly as his, her colleagues silenced in a chilling act of cover-up, leaving her adrift in terror. Their meeting feels almost fated, two lives shattered by the same system colliding in desperation. At first, she doesn't trust him. He represents the very machinery that destroyed her life. But his urgency, his refusal to abandon her, draws them together. The intimacy that begins to bloom is not romantic in the traditional sense. It is survival made human, two strangers tethered by the need to endure. What fascinates me about this stretch of the story is how it balances the micro and the macro. On one level, it's a personal tale, a man fighting to survive, a woman grappling with betrayal. On another, it's the exposure of something vast, a glimpse into the machinery of power that dehumanizes everyone it touches. The operatives are pawns, the scientists are pawns. Even the leaders themselves seem driven less by conviction than by fear of losing control. The world it paints is not one of heroism, but of survival within systems built to consume. The pacing of the first half builds steadily, layering tension with revelation. Each scene adds to the sense of suffocation. The program isn't just collapsing, it's cannibalizing itself. The protagonist realizes that to live, he must sever ties completely. But severing ties means more than escaping bullets. It means redefining himself outside the identity the system forced upon him. That's why the pills matter so much. They're not just enhancements. They're symbols of dependence, of control embedded in biology. The decision to fight for freedom from them, to reclaim ownership of his body and mind, becomes the emotional heartbeat of this arc. By the midpoint, the stakes have crystallized. He is no longer just running. He is searching for autonomy, for escape, for a way to shed the invisible chains that bound him from the moment he entered the program. Alongside him, the scientist becomes not only a companion, but a mirror, forcing him to see himself not as a weapon, but as a person. Their journey together sets the stage for revelations that promise to reshape not just their lives, but the narrative of the entire world they inhabit. And as the first half closes, we feel the story teetering on a knife's edge. The chase has only begun. The revelations are only half spoken, and the sense of something larger looming grows unbearable. For me, this is where the film's true brilliance lies, not just in the spectacle of survival, but in the questions it asks about who we are when stripped of the roles we were given. It's not just action, It's allegory, and that's what keeps me leaning forward, ready to see how the storm will break. The second half begins with the sense that the chase has reached a new level of urgency. The program's shadows are no longer confined to distant offices or silent command centers. They stretch into every corner, tightening around him and the scientist like a net that refuses to let go. What struck me most here was the contrast. The first half was about survival and isolation, but now the story expands into the intimacy of companionship. Two people who never should have met finding themselves bound together by necessity, fear, and a fragile trust that begins to resemble something more profound. Their escape shifts from wilderness to city, and with it comes a change in rhythm. Where mountains and snow forced him into primal survival, the city becomes a labyrinth of surveillance and pursuit. Every street corner hides a camera. Every alley could contain an enemy. Every passerby feels like a threat. I remember watching this and feeling my chest tighten, not because of the action itself, but because of the atmosphere, the overwhelming sense that in modern life, there's no true escape from being watched. It reminded me of times. Hovering above them are the architects of control, the bureaucrats, generals, and corporate figures who speak in clinical language about assets and programs while orchestrating murders with the click of a button. They are chilling not because they are monstrous caricatures, but because they are so ordinary. Their calm detachment, their preference for euphemism over truth, feels disturbingly familiar. They remind me of how institutions in our own world can distance themselves from the human cost of their decisions. In them, the story crystallizes its critique. Power doesn't need to rage to be terrifying. It can whisper, it can sit behind desks, it can smile while it erases. Then there is the hunter, an operative dispatched to eliminate the protagonist. He is, in many ways, the shadow's self, the embodiment of obedience, the endpoint of what the system wanted all along. He doesn't question, doesn't hesitate, doesn't falter. He is the perfect asset, and that perfection is horrifying. Watching him pursue with relentless precision, I felt the symbolic clash. Individuality versus conformity, defiance versus obedience, humanity versus machine. The antagonist is not merely a villain, but a mirror, showing the protagonist what he could have become had he surrendered fully. Their collision is less a battle of fists than of philosophies, fought through the language of violence because neither has the luxury of dialogue. The supporting figures scattered through the story, analysts, field officers, frightened colleagues, might seem peripheral, but even they are etched with significance. A colleague's trembling hands, an officer's cold efficiency, a scientist's silent panic during a cover-up, all of these fragments remind us that systems devour indiscriminately. Some comply, some resist, but none escape unscarred. They're the chorus to the central tragedy, voices that echo the theme that no one in such a system truly thrives. What makes this ensemble remarkable is the way they embody dualities. The protagonist is both weapon and man. The scientist is both architect of control and survivor of it. The hunter is both perfection and monstrosity. The bureaucrats are both civilized and inhuman. Even the holographic echoes of surveillance technology feel like characters in their own right, watching, recording, erasing, silently shaping the world the way gods once did in myths. Each character becomes a question. What does it mean to live authentically in a world determined to define you? When I reflect on them as a whole, I find myself less concerned with their spycraft and more with their humanity. I think of the protagonist's silence as snow falls on his shoulders, of the scientist's trembling voice as she chooses to help rather than flee, of the bureaucrat's calm tone as he orders a life erased. Each detail resonates because it feels real. I see pieces of myself in their doubts, pieces of the world in their compromises, pieces of philosophy in their struggles. They remind me that character, in the truest sense, is not about what people do, but what they reveal when they are cornered by forces larger than themselves. And that, I think, is why these characters linger long after the final chase fades from memory. They are not archetypes locked in genre. They're allegories of our own fractured humanity, asking us to consider what parts of ourselves are chosen and what parts are imposed. In their survival, their betrayal, their obedience, and their defiance, we find not just entertainment, but reflection. They become less characters in a spy thriller and more voices in a conversation we're still having about identity, power, and the fragile beauty of human choice. Strangeness often clings to films born out of legacy projects, and this one, fittingly, was steeped in oddities long before it reached audiences. To step into the behind-the-scenes world is to see how uncertainty, accident, and sheer improbability can shape a story just as much as a script or director ever could. When I first began reading about its production, I felt that same thrill I get when discovering the marginalia in an old novel. Little scribbles and forgotten notes that reveal the hidden life of the text. The strangeness here isn't just trivia. It's the echo of a film wrestling with its own identity, mirroring the very themes it puts on screen. The most obvious oddity was its very existence. This wasn't the next chapter everyone expected, because the face that defined the earlier films, the restless, haunted agent whose name became shorthand for an entire genre, wasn't here at all. Instead, the story veered sideways, introducing another operative shaped by the same machine, but living in the shadow of the myth. For me, this always felt like listening to a symphony that suddenly shifts to a different instrument mid-performance. Familiar melodies woven with unfamiliar tones. The strangest fact is that this wasn't just a narrative gamble. It was a production 1-2. Studios feared audiences wouldn't accept a continuation without the original hero. Yet they pushed forward anyway. Caught between commercial necessity and creative risk, filming itself carried its share of bizarre tales. To achieve the intensity of the wilderness training sequences, the lead actor endured sub-zero conditions in remote locations, reportedly pushing his body to the brink. Crew members later admitted that the discomfort wasn't staged. It was real, with breath freezing mid-air and equipment malfunctioning in the cold. One anecdote that always makes me smile is how locals in remote areas mistook the film crew for military exercises, given the strange sight of helicopters circling mountains while a lone figure scrambled through snow. In that confusion lies a perfect metaphor, reality and fiction blurring, the film's world bleeding into ours. Then there was the matter of the science, the enhancements that drive so much of the story. Behind the scenes, consultants were brought in to lend credibility to the biochemistry, crafting explanations for the pills and protocols. The strangeness here lies in how much detail was created that never made it onto the screen. Notebooks filled with diagrams, pseudoscientific jargon mapped out like a genuine research project. It was as though the filmmakers were writing a secret novel parallel to the film, invisible to audiences, but shaping the authenticity of what we saw. I've always loved this kind of hidden labor, because it mirrors the way literature often carries worlds between its lines that are never fully revealed. Looking back at all these details, the freezing mountains, the Manila streets turned into theater, the drones born from toys, the secrecy that mirrored the story's paranoia, I can't help but see the production as an extension of the film itself. It was a story about survival, about carving meaning out of chaos, and its making was exactly that, a balancing act between risk and restraint, between artistry and pragmatism, between the desire to honor a legacy and the need to create something new. And that, I think, is what makes its production so captivating. It wasn't smooth, it wasn't certain, but it was alive, messy, human, filled with strangeness that made the final product feel less like a machine-made blockbuster and more like an imperfect, ambitious text worth studying. The world this film builds is less a backdrop and more a living presence, a character in its own right. When I think of it, I don't remember just the actors' faces or the bursts of action. I remember the chill of the mountains, the claustrophobia of sterile labs, the chaos of Manila streets. Each setting isn't just where the story happens. It tells its own story, whispering about control, survival, and the fragile humanity caught between them. Watching it, I often felt like the places themselves were conspiring, either to erase the protagonist or to remind him that freedom comes at a cost. The opening in the mountains is perhaps the most striking use of setting as metaphor. Snow, silence, jagged peaks. It's a landscape that feels both beautiful and hostile, as though nature itself is testing him. The wide shots emphasize his smallness, the vulnerability of one body against the immensity of earth and sky. For me, those scenes echoed the kind of solitude we sometimes carry inside ourselves, the sense of being dwarfed by forces larger than us. The cold isn't just physical, it's existential. He moves through it with the determination of someone refusing to yield, but the camera makes clear how precarious survival is when the world itself seems indifferent. From there, the setting shifts to the interior spaces of the program, the laboratories, the offices, the hidden corridors of power. These spaces are lit with harsh whites, clinical and unforgiving. The mise-en scene here is minimal but chilling. Polished floors, rows of equipment, the sterile hum of machines. What struck me is how these spaces strip humanity from their occupants. Scientists work in silence. Operatives are discussed like inventory, and bureaucrats speak of lives in terms of liabilities. The setting itself embodies dehumanization. Every frame in these rooms reminded me of Foucault's writings on institutions. The way architecture can embody control, the way walls themselves can discipline those within. The scientist massacre scene is a perfect example. Fluorescent lights flicker over white walls, the horror unfolding not in darkness but in brightness. That inversion unsettled me deeply. The idea that evil doesn't always hide in shadows but often thrives in plain, sterile light. It's a setting that tells us everything about the world's moral collapse. Cruelty packaged as order, erasure disguised as efficiency. The transition to urban settings changes the rhythm entirely. Manila becomes a pulse, chaotic and alive, a stark contrast to the cold emptiness of mountains and labs. The camera here is handheld, weaving through crowds, following motorcycles through alleys too narrow for safety. The city feels like a maze, improvised, unpredictable, resistant to the control the program tries to impose. I loved how the settings seemed to side with the protagonist here. The chaos of the streets becomes his ally, masking him, giving him space to vanish in plain sight. It reminded me of how life in its rawest form, messy, unplanned, human, can resist the precision of oppressive systems. The cinematography by James Newton Howard, paired with Gilroy's vision, balances grandeur and intimacy. Wide shots place the protagonist as a speck in vast landscapes, emphasizing insignificance, while close-ups linger on breath, sweat, and trembling hands, grounding us in his humanity. The oscillation between scale and intimacy mirrors the film's themes. One man dwarfed by forces larger than him, yet defined by choices too small for the system to predict. Watching this balance, I thought of literature that moves from epic scope to whispered detail, reminding us that meaning often resides in both extremes. Lighting is crucial in shaping these settings. The mountains are lit in pale blues, evoking chill and solitude. The labs glow in blinding whites, stripping warmth and color. Manila bursts with saturated hues, yellows, reds, the shimmer of neon, visual chaos that mirrors narrative chaos. The climax, filmed under harsh daylight, denies us the comfort of shadows. Everything is visible, raw, unhidden. The choice unsettled me because it refused the usual tropes of espionage films, where shadows conceal. Here, daylight exposes. Sound design layers onto this atmosphere. In the wilderness, silence dominates, broken only by breath, wind, and the crunch of snow. In the labs, the hum of machines and the murmur of bureaucratic voices create a chilling sterility. In Manila, sound overwhelms. Horns, engines, shouts, chaos bleeding into every frame. I remember closing my eyes during one sequence and realizing I could tell exactly where we were in the story by sound alone. That's how integral sound is here. It's another setting, another character, shaping mood and meaning. Symbolism radiates from these environments. The pills are filmed like relics, shot in close-ups that make them appear larger than life. They represent dependence, control, the invisible chains of the program. The rooftops symbolize escape, but also exposure, freedom at the price of being seen. The crowded streets symbolize resistance, life too chaotic to be contained. And the final moments on the boat, with water stretching endlessly, symbolize reprieve, a fragile space carved out of the immensity of forces still hunting them. What I find most powerful about the settings is how they mirror the characters' internal journeys. The protagonist moves from isolation, mountains, to dehumanization, labs, to chaos, city, to fragile reprieve, ocean. The settings themselves tell his story, carrying him from silence to noise, from control to freedom. The scientist mirrors this journey. Her sterile labs collapse into bloodshed. Her knowledge transforms into survival. Her life, once defined by the system, now finding fragile autonomy in the chaos of Manila. The world is their arc, the settings their unspoken dialogue. To me, this is where the film feels most literary. Settings are not decoration, but language. The mountains speak of insignificance. The labs speak of control. The city speaks of resistance. The ocean speaks of possibility. Together, they tell a story as rich as any line of dialogue, reminding us that place is never neutral. It is always charged, always alive with meaning, always shaping those who move within it. The chase sequences, especially the climactic motorcycle pursuit in Manila, have also been dissected in countless ways. Action critics praise the realism and intensity, pointing to the reliance on practical stunts. Literary critics, however, were more interested in symbolism, the weaving through traffic as an image of improvisation against overwhelming force, the sharp turns and near crashes as metaphors for lives lived on the edge of erasure. What struck me was the way the chase captured the paradox of freedom, thrilling and terrifying, exhilarating yet unsustainable. You can run, you can dodge, you can even outpace the machine for a while, but you cannot entirely escape the system's gaze. That tension, momentary freedom within enduring control, is perhaps the most important lesson the film offers. Philosophical perspectives often circle around the theme of enhancement, those pills and protocols that keep the protagonist tethered to the program. Critics read this not just as a plot device, but as commentary on dependency and control. The enhancements symbolize how institutions regulate not just behavior, but biology, how power extends into the very flesh of its subjects. For me, this echoed Michel Foucault's idea of biopolitics, power exerted not through laws alone, but through the management of bodies. The protagonist's quest to sever that link, to become independent of the pills, reads as a philosophical rebellion. The fight to reclaim sovereignty over one's own body, even when doing so feels like risking collapse. Other critics were drawn to the character dynamics. The relationship between the operative and the scientist has been alternately praised as a refreshing partnership and criticized as underdeveloped. What I found striking was its refusal to settle into cliché. Their bond is not painted as fiery romance or as cold utility. It lives in a space between, built on necessity and deepened by recognition. She is not simply a damsel in distress. She is the key to his survival, and he becomes the shield for her existence. In that fragile bond, critics saw echoes of literary archetypes. Orpheus and Eurydice in reverse. Two figures fleeing not the underworld but the suffocating gaze of the world above. The absence of closure in the ending has also been a point of contention. Some critics felt cheated, as though the narrative abandoned them mid-stride. Others, myself included, saw the ending's ambiguity as its greatest strength. It does not promise safety, only survival. It does not destroy the system, only buys reprieve from it. This refusal to offer triumph echoes the structure of modernist literature, where resolution is less important than resonance. Life rarely offers neat endings. Why should a story about being hunted by faceless power pretend otherwise? From a cultural perspective, the film's release also sparked fascinating debates. It arrived at a time when audiences were saturated with sequels, reboots, and expansions of familiar franchises. Critics argued about whether it was evidence of Hollywood's creative exhaustion or a genuine attempt to reimagine a mythology from a new angle. Personally, I saw it as both. A product of commercial logic, yes, but also a sincere attempt to ask what happens when stories refuse to end neatly. Literature has always thrived on reinvention, on retellings and echoes, and in that light, the film belongs to a long tradition of narratives that expand not by repetition, but by fragmentation. Scholars of genre noted how it subverted spy tropes. Where many espionage films celebrate mastery, perfect planning, flawless execution, this one dwells on imperfection. The protagonist bleeds, falters, hesitates. The scientist trembles, doubts, panics. Even the antagonists, so ruthless in their systems, are driven not by omnipotence, but by fear of exposure. Critics praise this vulnerability as more authentic, more literary, than the sleek confidence of other spy narratives. I remember thinking that the film understood something essential, that true suspense doesn't come from watching perfection in motion, but from watching fragile humans improvise against impossible odds. Even the use of setting drew critical attention. The mountains at the beginning, the sterile labs, the chaotic streets of Manila, each became more than location. Critics wrote about how the mountains symbolized solitude and testing. The labs symbolized control and sterility. The Manila chase symbolized improvisation and life bursting through the cracks of systemized order. Watching these settings unfold, I felt as though the world itself was a character, reflecting the inner states of those who moved through it, and perhaps the most poignant critical perspective is this. The film itself became a metaphor for its own themes. Just as the protagonist struggles to assert his humanity against the system that created him, so too does the film struggle to assert its identity against the weight of its predecessor. It lives in the shadow of a legacy, constantly measured against what came before, always at risk of being dismissed as expendable. And yet, like its protagonist, it survives, not by being perfect, but by being defiant, by existing at all. That mirroring is what makes it, in my eyes, worth critical attention. So when I look back at the events and the debates, what I see is not a failed attempt to continue a franchise, but a deeply literary exploration of survival, identity, and legacy. Its imperfections are not flaws to me. They're the very reason it matters. It reminds us that to live in the shadow of something larger is not weakness, but opportunity, the chance to carve meaning out of absence, to find freedom in survival itself. The making of this film always felt to me like an act of improvisation in itself, much like the story it tells. I remember first learning about its production and being struck by how many layers of uncertainty surrounded it. There was no guarantee it would even exist, no certainty that audiences would accept it, no clear path to how it would expand a mythology already considered complete. And yet it was made through persistence, through risk, and through a kind of faith that art sometimes requires even when logic says otherwise. Looking back at the production now, it feels almost as fascinating as the movie itself. The chase sequences carried their own legends of strangeness. In Manila, where the climax unfolds, the production shut down entire neighborhoods, transforming daily life into orchestrated chaos. Residents watched as stunt doubles sped through crowded streets on motorcycles, often blurring into real traffic. Some accounts describe actual near collisions that ended up lending authenticity to the adrenaline on screen. There's a strange poetry in that, the film feeding on real unpredictability, chaos leaking in from the world it was staged within. Another odd fact that stuck with me. During one rooftop chase, stunt performers rehearsed so obsessively that nearby residents began gathering daily to watch, cheering them on as if it were a sport. For weeks, the boundary between performance and spectacle dissolved, the city itself becoming an audience before the audience. I imagine being there, standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers, watching art unfold not in the cinema, but against the skyline. Perhaps the strangest stories are about the legacy it carried. The writers wrestled with how to tie the narrative into its predecessors without overwhelming it. Entire subplots were drafted and discarded. At one point, a draft reportedly included direct appearances from familiar faces, only for those ideas to vanish in later rewrites. The final version carries their shadows, references whispered rather than shouted. To me, this feels like a palimpsest, a manuscript scraped and rewritten, where you can still see the ghost of earlier words beneath the ink. Marketing provided its own layer of strangeness. Trailers teased connections without clarifying them, leading to confusion about whether this was a continuation, a spin-off, or a reinvention. I remember conversations where people debated endlessly, some convinced the original hero would appear in secret, others dismissing the film as a diversion. This confusion was by design. Producers leaned into ambiguity, hoping it would spark curiosity. Yet in doing so, they mirrored the film's own themes. Identity obscured, truth hidden, narratives controlled by those in power. One detail that has always fascinated me is how much of the film relied on practical stunts. The rooftop leaps, the motorcycle chases, the drone sequences, all demanded intense choreography and real danger. The lead actor performed many of his own stunts, including sequences so perilous that insurance officials reportedly protested. At one point, during a high-speed chase, a crash went wrong, leaving crew shaken and equipment destroyed. Miraculously, no one was badly hurt, and footage salvaged from that day ended up in the final cut. It's strange how cinema often depends on the razor's edge of risk, how authenticity is born from chaos just barely controlled. And then there's the strangest fact of all. Despite its ambition, its risks, its sheer intensity, the film left audiences divided. Some praised it for expanding the universe. Others dismissed it as unnecessary. Critics were split, fans uncertain. Yet in its very divisiveness lies its legacy. It embodies the tension of living in the shadow of a myth, never able to step fully out, never able to fully belong. That strangeness, I think, is what makes it linger. It is less a sequel than a ghost story, haunted by a name it dared not repeat too loudly, yet unable to escape. When I think of all these odd details, the freezing breath, the notebooks of invented science, the manila rooftops turned into theater, the trailers that confused more than they clarified, I find myself smiling. Because, in a way, the strangeness of its creation mirrors the strangeness of its text. A story about survival against erasure was itself a film that struggled to assert its identity against the weight of expectation. That's the poetry of cinema. Sometimes the strangest facts reveal not accidents, but echoes, art imitating life in ways no one could have scripted. Critical perspectives on this film have always fascinated me because they tend to split into two camps. Those who see it as a bold experiment in extending a mythology, and those who view it as an unnecessary detour that wandered too far from the heart of the original trilogy. What interests me most is not which side is right, but how both responses reflect the film's central themes of identity, inheritance, and survival within systems that don't always want you to succeed. Watching it, I often felt as though the debates critics had about the movie were the very debates the characters themselves were living through. What does it mean to carry a legacy? What does it mean to exist in the shadow of something larger than yourself? One critical lens focuses on the way the story handles continuity. The events of earlier installments loom like specters over the narrative, mentioned in passing, referenced obliquely, never fully present. For some critics, this was a flaw, as if the story could never escape the gravitational pull of the name that defined the series. For others, it was a deliberate and even brilliant choice, positioning the protagonist as someone wrestling with the same invisibility audiences projected onto him. I personally found this doubling effect haunting. The absence of the original hero was not just a production choice, but a thematic presence, a reminder that legacies are as much about what's missing as what's seen. The film's events, when seen through a literary lens, read less like spycraft and more like allegory. The scientist massacre early in the second half, for example, is not only a brutal narrative turn, but also a metaphor for how systems purge their own when secrecy is threatened. Critics noted the cold detachment of the scene, the calm voice of the assassin, the sterile corridors bathed in fluorescent light, as evidence of a theme running throughout. Violence is not always loud or spectacular. Sometimes it's bureaucratic, antiseptic, horrifying precisely because it's routine. When I first watched that sequence, I remember thinking not of action films, but of Kafka. Ordinary lives snuffed out by faceless processes, guiltless and guilty alike erased because the system demanded it. The scientist, once fearful and hesitant, begins to shift. She is not merely cargo to be carried. She becomes essential to his fight. Her knowledge of the enhancements, of the science that created him, makes her both target and ally. Their partnership grows in fits and starts, moments of mistrust giving way to shared resolve. There's a scene where she risks everything to alter the very structure of his dependence, and it resonated with me deeply. It isn't framed as triumph, but as desperation, an act of courage that reminds us how much of our humanity lies in helping others shed their chains, even when we're still entangled in our own. As the second half unfolds, the threats grow sharper. The program escalates its pursuit, introducing a new operative design to be even more relentless, a ghost of the system that created him. This antagonist isn't just another pursuer. He is the embodiment of what the protagonist could have been had he surrendered completely to obedience. Their eventual confrontation feels inevitable, almost mythic, as if he must face a mirror image of himself to prove he can step beyond the role he was written to play. The action here intensifies, rooftop escapes, narrow alleys echoing with gunfire, motorcycles weaving through crowded streets. On the surface, it's adrenaline and spectacle, but beneath it lies allegory. Each pursuit isn't simply about avoiding death. It's about refusing erasure. Watching him navigate those impossible escapes, I thought of how often we're forced to improvise under pressure, to make choices we're unprepared for, to survive in spaces designed not for our flourishing, but for our disappearance. One of the most powerful sequences comes late in the film, when the chase crescendos into chaos on the streets of Manila. The setting itself is alive, dense, chaotic, pulsing with energy that makes every move unpredictable. The motorcycle sequence, with its impossible turns and narrow escapes, isn't just thrilling. It's symbolic of the improvisation that defines human survival. He doesn't win because he's perfect. He endures because he adapts, because he refuses to yield. It reminded me of moments when life felt like an endless gauntlet, when all I could do was keep moving, keep improvising, trusting that momentum itself might save me. Yet the film doesn't let us rest in triumph. Even in moments of victory, the shadows of the program linger. The scientist and the operative find themselves on borrowed time. Their survival, not an end, but a reprieve. And that's what stayed with me most, the refusal to tie things neatly. The story doesn't close with the system destroyed or the world made safe. It closes with two people, battered and uncertain, having carved out a fragile corner of freedom in a world still hostile to their existence. This choice, the refusal of neat closure, feels deeply literary to me. It mirrors the way real struggles often end, not with grand victories, but with small escapes, small defiances, moments of survival that mean everything even if the larger system still looms. That ending, with its sense of fragile reprieve, reminded me of how life often grants us only glimpses of peace, not permanence. And yet those glimpses matter. They're the proof that survival itself is an act of rebellion. By the time the credits roll, what lingers isn't just the memory of the chases or the violence. It's the intimacy of survival shared between two people. It's the way the protagonist, once defined only by discipline and orders, discovers fragments of his humanity in connection, in vulnerability, in the act of protecting and being protected. And it's the reminder that sometimes the most radical act isn't to topple the system outright, but to simply live in defiance of its attempts to erase you. The second half transforms the film from a thriller into something more, a meditation on freedom, identity, and the fragile bonds that tether us to meaning. Watching it, I felt not just entertained but unsettled, reflective, inspired to ask myself uncomfortable questions. How much of my life is shaped by forces I don't control? How much of who I am belongs to me? And how much was written by others? And perhaps most importantly, what does it mean to survive not just physically, but spiritually in a world that so often wants to turn us into tools, into numbers, into expendables? Those are the questions I carried with me long after the final scene, and they're the questions that make this story feel less like an action movie and more like a text worth studying, worth returning to, worth remembering. Characters are the pulse of any story, but here, they are more than participants in a spy narrative. They're vessels of metaphor, mirrors of our own struggles, and reminders that identity is fragile, contested, and deeply human. To speak of them is not to list their traits like bullet points in a dossier, but to feel their weight, their silences, their choices reverberating long after the final frame. The man at the center is at first glance defined by his physicality. He is strong, disciplined, engineered for endurance and obedience. Yet what makes him compelling is not the sharpness of his reflexes, but the fractures within. His introduction alone tells us he is both instrument and exile, shaped by a system that sees him as an asset, yet abandoned by that same system when it decides to clean house. What fascinates me most is how his humanity emerges precisely because he refuses to remain only what they made him. He begins as a tool. He becomes a man through doubt, through choice, through his refusal to be erased. Watching him grapple with dependence on the program's chemical leash reminded me of my own battles with systems that promised to make me better, but left me questioning whether the improvements were truly mine. His character becomes allegory. Our humanity shines most brightly when we fight for agency in spaces designed to deny it. Opposite him is the scientist, a woman whose brilliance makes her both powerful and profoundly vulnerable. She begins her journey in sterile labs, a cog in the machine of enhancement, her expertise valued only insofar as it feeds the program. When the machinery of secrecy turns on her, she is thrust into survival she never asked for. At first, she trembles, caught between fear and disbelief, but slowly, painfully, she finds strength. What moves me is how her character arc refuses cliché. She is not reduced to being rescued. Instead, she becomes a catalyst, using her knowledge to help the man sever his dependence, to help him reclaim ownership of his body. In her, I saw the quiet resilience of those who, even when shattered, find courage not in spectacle, but in persistence. Her bond with the protagonist feels less like romance and more like recognition. Two souls stripped of illusions, clinging to one another in defiance of erasure. What stands out first is the choice of direction. With the original trilogy so firmly tied to the vision of its creators, bringing in a new hand was always going to be risky. Tony Gilroy, who had already shaped much of the earlier films as a writer, stepped up as director, taking on the task of guiding a story into uncharted territory. There's a certain poetry in that decision, passing the camera to someone who already understood the rhythm of this world, who had written its silences and its explosions. For me, it felt like watching a novelist write a sequel to his own work in a different medium, with the freedom to finally expand on footnotes and hints he'd left behind. Casting brought its own set of fascinating stories. Jeremy Renner, stepping into the lead, carried the weight of expectation on his shoulders. He wasn't replacing anyone, exactly, but he was being asked to stand in the orbit of a legend without being consumed by it. Renner trained extensively, committing to the physical demands of the role. Accounts from the set describe his insistence on performing as many of his own stunts as possible, from rooftop runs to high-speed motorcycle chases. In interviews, he admitted that it was terrifying at times, but he believed authenticity mattered, that audiences could sense the difference between an actor living the moment and one stepping aside for a double. His determination reminded me of the protagonist himself, refusing to let the system erase his individuality. Rachel Weisz brought a very different energy to the set, known for her depth and nuance. She approached her character not as an accessory to the story, but as its heart. Crew members often described how she would ask questions about the science behind her character's work, pressing for details that might never appear on screen, but gave her something to hold on to. That intensity translated into her performance, grounding the story in emotional truth. Watching her, I was reminded of the quiet strength of characters in literature who carry knowledge as both weapon and burden. Filming stretched across multiple countries, each bringing its own strangeness. The wilderness sequences were shot in freezing conditions that tested not just the actors, but the entire crew. Cameras froze, breath crystallized midair, and safety became a constant concern. Renner later joked that the mountains were as much a character as any actor, unpredictable and demanding. In contrast, the Manila sequences unfolded in sweltering heat, with streets packed with residents watching the spectacle unfold. Entire neighborhoods were shut down for filming, and locals often gathered on rooftops to witness motorcycle chases tearing through alleys. Some days the line between fiction and reality blurred, with real traffic weaving dangerously close to stunt sequences. Crew members spoke of near misses, of adrenaline that wasn't just cinematic but real. One fun fact I love is that residents began treating the production as a kind of community theater. People cheered for the stunt performers, applauded successful takes, and even offered food and water to exhausted crew. For a few weeks, the city became both set and audience, living inside the story as much as watching it. I can't help but smile at that image. Cinema bleeding into daily life, art and community colliding in the most unexpected ways. The drone sequences, which feel chillingly modern in the film, were achieved through a combination of practical effects and digital layering. What's strange is how rudimentary some of the practical models were. Small, almost toy-like devices that were later transformed through visual effects into terrifying machines of surveillance. It's a reminder of how cinema relies on illusion, on the willingness of everyone involved to imagine the menace in a harmless object. That's something I think about often. How much of art is about trust, about believing in a reality that isn't there until it's built together? Behind the camera, Villeneuve's quiet reverence is replaced here with Gilroy's meticulous pragmatism. Reports from the set describe him as calm, deliberate, almost surgical in his decisions. He wasn't interested in spectacle for its own sake. He wanted coherence. He wanted logic. Some crew members said he treated the production like solving an equation, each element needing to align precisely. That approach gave the film its sense of control, even when chaos dominated the screen. Music played a quieter role in the production, deliberately leaning away from overt motifs of earlier entries. The decision was controversial but intentional. Producers wanted the film to sound different, to carve its own space. Composers blended tense orchestral layers with industrial undertones, echoing the dual themes of humanity and machinery. Critics later debated whether the music lacked identity, but for me, its restraint mirrored the protagonist's struggle. It wasn't about grandeur, it was about surviving beneath the weight of silence. One of the most unusual aspects of the production was its secrecy. Scripts were closely guarded, with cast often receiving only the scenes they were in. Renner once admitted he had to piece together the larger story on his own, learning the arc almost in real time. In a way, that confusion bled into his performance, lending authenticity to the sense of a man discovering truths too big for him to grasp at once. It's strange how life imitates art, actors stumbling through uncertainty while playing characters doing the same. Financially, the film was a calculated gamble. The studio hoped to extend a profitable franchise, but they knew the absence of the original hero would divide audiences. Budgets ballooned due to extensive location shooting and complex stunts. Manila, in particular, stretched resources with logistical nightmares of closing streets and coordinating hundreds of extras. Crew members later said they often felt like they were staging an actual military operation rather than a film shoot. That strangeness, filmmakers mimicking the systems they were critiquing, feels almost too poetic to ignore. When production wrapped, cast and crew reflected on the exhaustion and intensity. Weisz described it as one of the most physically demanding shoots of her career, not because of stunts, but because of the emotional weight. Renner, battered and bruised, admitted he left the set both drained and exhilarated, unsure how audiences would respond. Gilroy spoke of relief, not triumph, as though finishing the film was itself the victory. And perhaps that's why the film lingers. Long after the details of the plot fade, I still feel the cold of the mountains, the sterile hum of the labs, the chaos of Manila streets. These settings are memories etched in atmosphere, cinematic environments that ask us to reflect on our own worlds. Where do we feel dwarfed? Where do we feel controlled? Where do we feel alive in chaos? Where do we find reprieve, however fragile? Those questions echo every time I return to this story, and they remind me why cinema, like literature, matters, not for the spectacle, but for the spaces it creates in our imagination. Behind the scenes, this film unfolded like a mirror of its own story. Ambitious, risky, often chaotic, and carried forward by sheer determination. The production was less about gliding smoothly from script to screen and more about survival in a world of competing pressures, high expectations, and fragile trust. I've always found that the stories behind films say just as much about art as the films themselves. And in this case, those stories feel hauntingly similar to the themes we see on screen. From the very start, the project was burdened by expectation. The trilogy that came before had carved out its place in cinema with a raw, visceral style that reshaped what we thought spy thrillers could be. To step into that world again, but without the central figure who defined it, felt like walking into a room where a ghost lingers. Tony Gilroy, who had already left his fingerprints all over the earlier films as a writer, was asked to take the helm as director. That decision was controversial even before the cameras rolled. Gilroy was known for his sharp, cerebral storytelling, but directing a franchise of this scale was a different beast. Crew members described his demeanor as calm, deliberate, and precise, as though he were solving a problem rather than orchestrating chaos. For me, that approach feels fitting. The film itself is about a man methodically finding a way through uncertainty, and Gilroy mirrored that process. Jeremy Renner's casting brought its own complexities. He was fresh from roles that emphasized intensity, and here he was asked to embody a man defined by discipline but shaped by doubt. Renner threw himself into the role physically, training extensively in martial arts, endurance, and weapons handling. Stunt coordinators recounted his insistence on doing his own rooftop runs and motorcycle chases, even when safety officials protested. One day, during a high-speed sequence, Renner lost control of his bike, skidding dangerously close to a barricade. He wasn't badly injured, but the crew was shaken. That moment became almost symbolic. Renner himself caught between control and chaos, just like his character. Rachel Weisz brought a quieter energy to the production. Known for her meticulous preparation, she dove deep into the role of the scientist, even meeting with real researchers to understand the nuances of chemical engineering. Her colleagues described her as the heart of the set, someone who grounded everyone else when exhaustion or tension flared. She often asked Gilroy probing questions about motivation, about subtext, about how her character might carry the weight of betrayal. I imagine those conversations echoing late at night, between takes, shaping the intimacy that radiates on screen. Filming locations told their own stories. The wilderness sequences were shot in Canada and Alaska, where freezing conditions tested everyone's endurance. Cameras froze, generators stalled, actors shivered through endless takes. Renner later admitted that those scenes weren't acting. He was genuinely miserable, every breath clouding in the air, every movement a battle against the cold. In a way, that authenticity gave the sequences their edge. Watching him stumble through snow on screen, I now think of the crew off camera, bundled in layers, fighting frostbite while capturing images that looked like desolation but felt like survival. The Manila shoot was the polar opposite: blistering heat, packed streets, and logistical nightmares. The production effectively shut down sections of the city, turning ordinary neighborhoods into orchestrated chaos. Stunt drivers weaved through alleys so narrow that even locals gasped, convinced the bikes would crash. At one point, an accident did happen. A stuntman was thrown from his motorcycle during a take, suffering injuries that paused filming for days. The crew was shaken, but the sequence was eventually completed, with real near collisions adding to its visceral energy. Residents, meanwhile, embraced the spectacle. Crowds gathered daily, turning the shoot into a community event. Some even cheered when stunts succeeded, clapping from rooftops as if the chase belonged as much to them as to the film. That image, the blending of art and life, still makes me smile. Secrecy was another defining feature. Scripts were distributed sparingly, often only to those who needed specific pages. Renner confessed in interviews that he rarely knew the full arc of the story while filming, learning pieces as he went along. That uncertainty bled into his performance, giving his portrayal of confusion and doubt an authenticity that wasn't entirely staged. Crew members joked that everyone on set was living inside the same paranoia the story depicted, never knowing who knew what, never sure what would happen next. The drone sequences posed particular challenges. While much of the menace was crafted digitally, practical models were also used to help actors respond naturally. These models, small and almost toy-like, buzzed overhead during takes. It's strange to think that the cold, terrifying drones we see on screen began as harmless props. The transformation in post-production is a reminder of how cinema thrives on illusion, on trusting that imagination can turn the small into the terrifying. Music and sound design were equally deliberate. The decision to step away from the iconic sounds of the earlier trilogy was controversial but intentional. Composers crafted a score that leaned into tension and restraint, less bombastic and more atmospheric. Crew members recalled Gilroy insisting that silence be used as much as sound, allowing audiences to feel unease through absence. In one sequence, Renner's heavy breathing and the whir of wind replaced any music, amplifying the rawness of survival. I've always admired that restraint. It takes confidence to let silence speak louder than melody. The production wasn't without friction. Reports circulated of creative disagreements between Gilroy and studio executives, particularly about how much the story should connect to its predecessors. Some executives pushed for cameos or direct tie-ins, while Gilroy argued for independence. Ultimately, the film landed in the middle. Shadows of the earlier films linger, but the new narrative insists on its own voice. That tension is visible in the final cut, a film both haunted by legacy and striving for autonomy. When the shoot finally wrapped, cast and crew were left with exhaustion and relief. Weisz described the experience as intense but transformative, while Renner admitted he wasn't sure how audiences would respond. Gilroy, characteristically understated, called it a difficult but necessary film. Their words echo the story itself. Characters uncertain of survival, clinging to fragile victories, unsure of what comes next. Looking back, what strikes me most is how the behind-the-scenes journey mirrored the themes of the film. Cast and crew endured extremes of weather, uncertainty, risk, and conflict, yet they carried the project through to completion. Like the protagonist himself, the production survived not by being flawless, but by improvising, adapting, and pushing forward despite the odds. In that way, the film is more than its final cut. It is a testament to the resilience of those who made it, a story of survival carved into cinema. Themes in this film ripple beneath the surface like undertows, unseen at first, but powerful enough to pull everything into their current. What looks on paper like a story about espionage and survival is, when read closely, a meditation on identity, control, and the fragile boundaries between human agency and systemic power. Every time I return to it, I notice another thread woven through its fabric. Threads of memory, legacy, biology, and choice, tied together in ways that feel less like an action film and more like a novel in disguise. At its core, the story is about identity, or rather, the struggle to claim it in a world that has already written it for you. The protagonist is introduced not as an individual, but as an asset, a designation that strips him of name, past, and autonomy. His very body is a creation of the program, enhanced by chemistry and training, calibrated like a machine. Yet what resonates is how he resists this reduction. The pills, the schedules, the cold rituals meant to erase individuality. These become his chains. His journey is not about choosing between right and wrong in the traditional sense. It is about carving a self out of a system that sees him only as property. I've felt echoes of this in my own life. Moments when I realized the roles handed to me weren't truly mine, that to live authentically meant defying the scripts written for me. That's what gives this theme its sting. Identity isn't inherited, it's wrestled from forces that want to define us. Closely tied to this is the theme of control. The program is a machine of surveillance and regulation, one that extends its power into biology itself. The enhancements, presented as miracles of science, are also shackles, reminders that his existence is conditional, maintained by the same system that can erase him with the flip of a switch. Critics have often read this as a metaphor for modern biopolitics, where institutions manage not only behavior but bodies. For me, it feels painfully relevant. How often are we asked to surrender parts of ourselves, our time, our health, our freedom, in exchange for belonging or security? The film takes that tension to its extreme, but its roots are in everyday life. The theme of dependency radiates from this. The protagonist's reliance on enhancement is more than physical. It's existential. The fear of losing access to those pills isn't just fear of weakness. It's fear of collapse, of vanishing without the machinery that sustains him. The scientist's role in altering the dependency transforms the theme into something almost mythic. Liberation through pain, through risk, through trust in another. It's a theme I find especially moving because it resonates with the human experience of letting go of crutches, whether literal or metaphorical, and the terrifying freedom that follows. Another thread is legacy. The earlier films haunt this one, their protagonist absent but omnipresent, his actions sending shockwaves that define the world of this story. For some, this absence was a flaw, but for me, it was a thematic masterstroke. Legacy here is weight, the burden of inheriting chaos, the struggle to live in the shadow of myths that were never yours. The protagonist is not the original hero. He is someone who must define himself in the wake of another's choices. Isn't that what so many of us face? Living in the echoes of parents, mentors, histories that precede us? This theme feels deeply literary. The way Faulkner or Morrison wrote about the past pressing on the present, demanding reckoning survival itself, becomes a theme that transcends action. Every chase, every close call, is about more than escaping bullets. It is about proving existence against erasure. The program seeks to wipe out its own creations, to silence loose ends, to tidy the messiness of human life. The protagonist's survival becomes an act of rebellion. When I think about this, I'm reminded of the quiet survival acts we all perform. Choosing to keep going in a world that often feels indifferent or hostile, carving small sanctuaries of meaning even when systems push us toward silence. The partnership between the protagonist and the scientist adds another thematic dimension, the possibility of connection amid erasure. Their bond is not framed as grand romance, but as fragile trust, as recognition between two people who see the system for what it is. She, once a cog in the machine, becomes witness and ally. He, once a tool, becomes protector and companion. Together, they embody the theme of interdependence, the idea that even when stripped of autonomy, humanity survives through connection. Symbolism is woven throughout. The pills symbolize both power and bondage, their smallness belying their immense hold. The drones symbolize the faceless cruelty of bureaucracy, machines programmed to erase without question. The mountains symbolize isolation and testing, nature itself indifferent to survival. The labs symbolize sterility, order masquerading as progress. The crowded Manila streets symbolize resistance, life too chaotic to be contained. And the boat at the end, drifting into uncertain waters, symbolizes reprieve, not freedom absolute, but a fragile space carved out of survival. Even the antagonists embody symbolism. The bureaucrats, calm and efficient, symbolize how power operates not with rage, but with detachment. The enforcer, relentless and obedient, symbolizes what the protagonist might have become had he never questioned. The scientist massacre symbolizes how systems consume their own, erasing individuals for the sake of secrecy. Each act of violence is more than plot. It's allegory, a reminder that power thrives on erasure, and survival is the act of refusing to vanish. Time itself becomes a subtle theme. The pacing of the film, slower and more meditative than many expected, mirrors the protagonist's internal struggle. Each long take, each pause and silence, forces us to sit with the weight of uncertainty. Time here is not a rush toward climax, but a heavy presence, pressing down like the mountains, dragging like bureaucracy. It reminded me of literature that lingers deliberately, refusing to give us the comfort of speed. What lingers with me most is the theme of choice. The protagonist is not chosen by destiny, not gifted a legacy, not destined for greatness. He is ordinary in the sense that his life could be erased with a signature. Yet he chooses to fight, to protect, to endure. That choice, not grand, not world-saving, but deeply human, feels like the true heartbeat of the story. It tells us that humanity is not defined by systems or legacies, but by what we decide to do, even when the odds are impossible. And in the final image, as the boat drifts into open water, the themes converge. Identity reclaimed, dependency shed, survival won, but not guaranteed, connection forged in defiance. It's not triumph, it's reprieve. It's not resolution, it's resonance. And that, to me, is what makes the story feel more like literature than franchise. It refuses neat closure, insisting instead that we sit with ambiguity, with questions, with the fragile beauty of survival itself. Filmmaking at its best is not just craft, but philosophy, a way of thinking about how images, sounds, and rhythms can speak where words fall short. This film, born in the shadow of a trilogy that had already reshaped the genre, faced the daunting task of both honoring its lineage and staking out its own identity. To me, the filmmaking techniques here feel like a conversation between tradition and innovation, between restraint and spectacle, between the expectations of audiences and the ambitions of artists. And when I think back on it, what lingers is not only the story it told, but the way it told it, the tools it used to weave its atmosphere of survival, control, and fragile humanity. The cinematography struck me first. Unlike the shaky immediacy that defined earlier entries, here the camera often pulls back, allowing us to feel the scope of landscapes, the cold immensity of mountains, the sterile geometry of laboratories, the chaos of Manila streets. The choice is deliberate. Where the earlier films immersed us in disorientation, this one gives us room to breathe, to observe. Wide shots make the protagonist look small against vast settings, reminding us visually of how insignificant one person seems against the machinery of power. Yet close-ups return us to his breath, his sweat, the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. This oscillation between scale and intimacy mirrors the film's themes. We are small against systems, but within us lies the possibility of defiance. Lighting carries much of the story's symbolism. The wilderness is lit in pale blues and grays, every frame echoing solitude and fragility. The laboratories blaze with blinding whites, sterile and suffocating. The Manila sequences are alive with yellows, reds, and neon chaos, each frame saturated with movement and unpredictability. One of my favorite choices comes in the climax, where daylight dominates the chase. Instead of hiding violence in shadows, the film forces us to see everything in raw light. There's no concealment, no comfort, just exposure. It unsettled me because it felt like the opposite of genre convention, as though the film was saying, "We will not let you hide in darkness. You must confront what this looks like when laid bare." Editing is slower here than many expected, and that slowness is intentional. Long takes dominate, particularly in the early wilderness sequences. The pauses let us feel the weight of isolation, the rhythm of survival. Later, the editing accelerates during chases, cutting rapidly, disorienting us in the best way. That contrast between slowness and speed is itself a storytelling device. It mirrors the protagonist's journey, moments of reflection punctuated by bursts of desperate flight. I've always admired when filmmakers use editing not as decoration, but as narrative rhythm. And here that rhythm feels almost literary, as though we're moving between long, meditative paragraphs and sudden fragments of staccato prose. Sound design is equally critical. In the mountains, silence dominates, broken only by wind and breath. In the labs, the hum of machines and the low murmur of bureaucratic voices emphasize sterility. In Manila, noise overwhelms, horns blaring, engines screaming, crowds shouting. Each setting sounds different because each setting is different, not just geographically, but thematically. The soundscape itself tells us what kind of world we are in, one of solitude, one of control, one of chaos. The score, too, plays a restrained role. It does not seek to dominate with melody. Instead, it leans into tension and atmosphere, echoing the protagonist's internal unease. Where earlier entries had motifs that became iconic, here the music recedes, leaving room for silence. That silence, for me, is the bravest choice. It forces us to lean in, to sit with discomfort. The reliance on practical effects adds another layer of authenticity. The rooftop runs, the motorcycle chases, the crashes, all were staged with real danger. Stunt coordinators orchestrated sequences in crowded Manila streets where unpredictability was inevitable. When a stuntman was injured during filming, it underscored how thin the line is between spectacle and reality. Watching those sequences, I can